Hello, this is Rainer Koschnick from Germany, and I love alternative comics. This episode of the Comics Alternative is brought to you by Patreon supporters like me. Enjoy the show.
This is the Comics Alternative, episode 178, reviews of Not Away, Gulag Casual, and Haunted Love #1. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Comics Alternative. I'm Derek.
And I'm Andy, and we're two guys with PhDs talking about comics.
And on this week's episode, we're going to be looking at three recent titles. We're going to begin with Joshua W. Cotter's Not Away. After that, we're going to look at a new book from Austin English, Gulag Casual. And then after that, we're going to wrap up with another new title from friend of the show, Craig Yo, and this is issue #1 of Haunted Love. But before we get to those titles, we want to let all of you guys know that this episode of the Comics Alternative is brought to you by the great folks at Discount Comic Book Service. Go to their website, dcbservice.com, for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. There, you're going to find all DC, Marvel, Image, and Dark Horse titles at 40% off of the cover price if you pre-order. For all of the other publishers, you'll find that those discounts are 20 to 35% off of the cover price. And every single month, including March, you're going to find some unbelievable specials. Sometimes you'll find discounts at 45% off cover price. Sometimes those specials will be at 50% off. But often, you can find discounts that go higher from there.
And as you've come to expect, they always have a lot of great bundles at DCB Service. A couple of those worth mentioning. There is a Valiant bundle, which is the 9 newest Valiant titles for 50% off. There's also a new Vertigo bundle, 12 new Vertigo issues for 50% off. And Derek, I was really kind of delighted to find that they actually have a Hanna-Barbera bundle.
Wow.
It's 2 comics, but cool, it's 50% off, so there's lots of great stuff there.
Yeah, those are those two new DC titles that were in the most recent previews catalog, right?
Right.
Yeah. You know, you have great discounts every single month at Discount Comic Book Service. Go to their website, dcbservice.com, for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. And after you do get your comics there, please be sure to send them an email and tell them that the two guys with PhDs sent you.
Yeah, please do that. That would be great.
And you know, Andy, this show is also sponsored by another great company, and that is Just Coffee Co-op. It's a great place to get coffee, tea, and chocolates. All of their coffee is 100% fair trade, shade-grown, and organic certified. What's more, everything is roasted to order. They do everything in small batches. There is no mass production.
That's right. And remember, when you go to Just Coffee Co-op and use the coupon code COMICS, that's COMICS, you will get a 10% discount on your order. And also remember that shipping is always free and there's no minimum order.
That's right. You know, it's a win-win-win situation. You get 10% off by using the coupon code COMICS. You help out us, the Comics Alternative, and you also get great coffee from Just Coffee Co-op. Go to their website, justcoffee.coop. It's a great place to get caffeinated.
That's right, and you need to be caffeinated to read some good graphic novels and comics.
That's right. Well, Andy, it's been a while since you and I have done the show together. How have you been, my friend?
I've been pretty good. I was very excited today. 4 days ago in Maryland, it was snowing, and today it reached a high of 74, so I'm feeling pretty good.
Yeah, wacky spring weather.
It's crazy.
Yeah. So good to talk with you on the show again, and we got three really interesting titles that I want to get to. Before we do, though, I want to get back to a call to action that we first announced last month, and that is a survey that we're conducting. I would like for all of our listeners to take a very, very brief survey. You can find the survey at this URL, survey.libsyn.com/comicsalternative. That's survey.libsyn.com/comicsalternative. And when you go to that survey, you'll find that there are only six questions. Very simple. We're just curious about who our listeners are and the kind of questions that you'll find there to answer things like gender, age, ethnicity, education, things of that sort. There's even a place to put in your email address. Now, you don't have to, but if you do enter your email address in the survey, then you will be entered in a drawing that we will do in another month or so for one person to win a new Comics Alternative t-shirt. And I say new because we haven't done them yet, but we do plan on printing them up before Heroes Con. And when we do, one lucky winner will get a Comics Alternative t-shirt. But you have to go to survey.libsyn, libsyn.com/comics alternative. Take the survey, put in your email address, and we'd very much appreciate that.
Yeah, so just 6 questions, huh?
Yeah, just 6 questions, very quick. Just take a few minutes.
Yeah, well, you got to do that, and a chance to win a Comics Alternative T-shirt. Yeah.
That's right. So, Andy, you want to get to the titles that we're discussing for this week?
Yeah, let's do that.
We are going to start with Joshua W. Cotter's Not Away. This came out in February from Fantagraphics. And Andy, you and I were talking right before we started recording about other work from Cotter. Now, both of us are familiar with The Skyscrapers of the Midwest, which came out in book form from Ad House in 2008. And you haven't read that either, right? Because I haven't.
No, it's kind of been on my list of books to look for, and it's been on there for a while, but I have not explored that yet.
Yeah, same here. I wish that I had taken the time to read that before Not Away, and maybe it could have given me a little more context, not in terms of the story Not Away, but in terms of Joshua Cotter's style. And by style, I don't so much mean his art style as much as I mean his storytelling style. Because Not Away is a fascinating narrative, but it's a little unusual, wouldn't you say?
It is a little unusual, and the art style, I agree with you, it's really not the art style that I needed a little bit of, could have used a little, pre-knowledge of, but it's how he tells his story. And there are a lot of things I know that we're going to explore about it. Some of his storytelling techniques are pretty easy to pick up on. Others are a little bit more hard to decipher what's going on. It's a very densely packed story as far as text goes. Mm-hmm. So there's quite a bit to talk about with this title. Yeah,
and along with the packed text, as you point out, the art is very detailed as well. I mean, this is one of those works that you just know that the artist took a lot of time to sit down and meticulously go over the visual narrative that's being told, as well as the text, as you mentioned.
Yeah, and the book is over 200 pages, and I would say the majority of those pages are, as you said, Derek, they're very densely written and drawn. Cotter, again, has obviously spent a lot of time and care crafting this entire work, text-wise and art-wise.
Okay. So before we get into a breakdown of what makes this book worth picking up, maybe we should tell the listeners a little bit about the premise, what's going on in Not Away. How would you describe this narrative?
Well, Derek, you and I were talking off mic about the significance of the title "Nod Away," and I know we're going to get into a couple of those things. The book starts with what looks like some lines from poetry, and I actually wondered if this was the children's poem "Winkin', Blinkin', and Nod." I didn't look at it to see. But the opening, you have a lot of sparse letters that multiply and overlap and actually become words inside of bubbles, and those multiply themselves and they kind of drift downward. So you kind of get this feeling of things accumulating and words accumulating. And as we see in the story, technology accumulates. The basic story is about a young woman named Melody McCabe, who is a scientist. She is going to do some work on I guess we would call it a space station or that type of thing, to work on what really is an interdimensional wormhole that could connect humans to another world. Now, during this time, whenever this takes place, there's a technology that will allow us to basically access the internet without a device, but as a human. We can access it through our bodies.
Right, basically. And there's a device that those who are able, because not every human at this point, as we're told in the story, is able to connect to, I guess, the internet. They don't call it the internet, it's the internet, I-N-N-E-R, net. Yeah. But there's a device that connects to the brain and the spinal cord, and that's how people connect in this manner. But not everybody's able to do that.
Right. In fact, Melody herself is incapable of doing that, or incapable of what they call streaming.
Right.
A little bit different than what we would call streaming. But it seems like the key to the story is this little girl named Eva. And she is actually connected, and she is the one that's really kind of experimentally trying to figure out or trying to be the access point for that interdimensional wormhole. So a lot of what Melody is doing is keeping an eye on Eva, testing her, seeing how we might actually access this other dimension.
Now, see, this is interesting because I didn't pick up on the fact that this little girl, Eva, was connected to the wormhole. I thought that she was basically the hub, in other words, the means by which everyone connected through this internet, through, what you called streaming. Because at the very beginning of the story, we get a little exposition. And in fact, I think that Cotter does an outstanding job when it comes to exposition, setting up his narrative in a way that's very useful and effective without really hitting you over the head with things. Mm-hmm. But one of the scientists behind the internet, and then I guess the interdimensional research that's being done, is Dr. Bertrand Ernest, and he works, we find out later on, with a Dr. Sirius, who becomes a major player later on. Mm-hmm. And Ernest is talking about the internet, again, I-N-N-E-R net, and how people connect in that way. And he makes it seem that there is some kind of computer or computing system that actually connects the people. But we learn later on, and I don't think that this is a spoiler in any way, that it's not through any kind of hardware that people are connecting one to the other, but it's through, at least the way I read it, this little girl, Eva. In fact, that is what is behind potential terrorist activity from what's his name? Reverend Black Angus. His name is Reverend Angus, but they call him Black Angus.
Yeah, Church of Emancipation.
Yeah, and he is very much against using children, in this case Eva, as a way of, connecting people through this internet hub. But I didn't see her as directly linked to this interdimensional wormhole. Did I just miss that?
I may be wrong with that, and maybe I'm jumping to a conclusion that I thought that connection was there, but I may be wrong about that. But certainly she is a pivotal person in that. I think she's really part of that. Again, I hope that's not too big of a spoiler. Readers can read it for themselves and let us know, and if they think I'm full of it, that's fine too. But I believe that she was a connection to both of those aspects of the story.
Yeah, and I'm glad that you pointed this out, and we're discussing this question of the role of Eve, both with the internet but also the wormhole, because this brings up the matter of the number of balls that Cotter is juggling in this story. And there are a number of them, and I think he does it in a very adept way, but at times trying to connect the various threads is not the easiest thing. So, for instance, in one storyline we have, the protagonist, Dr. McCabe, Melody McCabe, who comes to this space station, the SS Integrity is what it's called, and, she's coming there to work with Dr. Sirius, overseeing Eva. And, this has everything to do with the internet, but there's also that interdimensional wormhole that you mentioned. So then there's the connection between what they're doing with the internet and Eva and the wormhole. And then there is another narrative thread that I assume has something to do with the interdimensional wormhole in some manner. And this is with a character he really doesn't have a name, and we see him at the very beginning of this book as the story is being set up, although at the time we don't know who this character is. And you mentioned earlier that you keep calling him in your head the Scraggly Man, and I think that that's one way for us to describe him because he doesn't have a name. But this Scraggly Man appears, and throughout most of the book, in the way that the story is set up, you'll have, I guess, what you could call the main storyline, or at least the dominant storyline, and this is where Dr. McCabe is on the Integrity with Eva, and then other characters as well. We haven't even mentioned them yet. Right. But then another narrative thread is involving the Scraggly Man, and for the most part, it's him wandering across what looks like a forlorn landscape. It's another world somewhere. We don't really know much detail. We don't know who he is. We don't know where he is. We don't know how he got there. Although the first time we really see him, he seems to be coming out of some kind of cryonic sleep in some way. I don't know if you call it cryonic, but he's put in some, it looks like suspended animation. He comes out of that, and then he starts wandering this land. So this narrative thread with the Scraggly Man is very ill sketched, but it purposely so. Okay, so, and I don't mean that as a criticism. It raises a lot of questions. And to me, one of the biggest questions is, what role does this have to play into the dominant storyline with Melanie McCabe on the Integrity?
And that's an excellent point. And we spoke to this a little bit off mic, but his, as you said, Derek, his story is very isolated, and he's isolated as well. But the story, we go for long stretches with Melody's story without really getting an awful lot of what the Scraggly Man is up to. His story is very slow in developing. And there are a lot of panels where we see very little change. So we get the impression that this is something, his journey is something that's developed over a very, very long amount of time. Whether that time has anything to do as far as the way we think of time, as far as Melody's story is concerned, we're not sure of that. One of the things that we talked about too was I wondered if the title Nod Away had anything to do with the land of Nod, which I spoke to you, Derek, and I said, I think this is something that comes out of the Bible, but I couldn't remember exactly where it is. But you actually found it, and the land of Nod was where Cain wandered after he killed his brother Abel in the book of Genesis.
It's supposed to be east of Eden.
East of Eden. So there's this wandering theme that the Scraggly Man is certainly has elements of that in his story. I don't want to get too much into what he's doing because, number one, I don't want it to be a spoiler, and number two, I'm not exactly sure how it relates to what's going on.
Yeah, that's a good point. And, the first chapter where we see this character, the Scraggly Man, as we're calling him, has a title. All sections or chapters, if we want to call them chapters, have titles in some way, and this one's called Nod. So when I first saw this, I thought that perhaps this man was named Nod, and for all we know, he could be. But we're just calling him the Scraggly Man. So it's a really interesting question where he figures into the more dominant storyline that takes place on the Integrity. But getting back to that dominant storyline, you have Melody, who is getting used to living off-world, doing the research that she's doing, but she gets involved with other researchers who are also on the Integrity, who are part of this project as well. And I think the most significant partner of hers, or colleague, is another scientist by the name of Christian Savvy. Mm-hmm. And he is someone that she even becomes involved with.
Yeah. And, this is another one of those things, too, about the character names that Cotter gives them. We're not sure. I mean, some of these character names, it's almost like something out of that is just supposed to be a straight satire, like something out of Dr. Strangelove, like Jack the Ripper, and all these really odd names. I mean, you've got this guy named Christian Savvy. I mean, you wonder if that's supposed to be some kind of joke. And then you've got one of the workers that Melody meets is Okonomiyaki, and it's one of those things you say it really fast. And
Okonomiyaki is how I.
Yeah, and it sounds really weird. And then there's another guy named Thaddeus J. Squirrel. I mean, there's all these really odd names, and we laugh at them, and we think, okay, this is going to have like an element of humor to it, and it does have an element of humor. There's a lot of humor interspersed throughout this entire graphic novel. But it's definitely not a comedy, because there are too many things in here of serious weight for it to be that. So one of the, and I won't call it a problem, but maybe some of the challenges I had with Not Away was trying to figure out, what type of book am I reading?
Yeah, that's a good point. And I'm glad you mentioned the potential humor packed into some of these names, because I noticed that as well. One character that you didn't mention is one of the first people that Melody meets, and that is Lance Iota. Yeah. And this is someone who is kind of a low man on the totem pole, kind of insignificant, but yet he's interested, obviously, in Melody, but she doesn't really give him much of the time of day. But I think the last name Iota is rather significant. We already mentioned the Reverend Black Angus, but there's also the aforementioned Dr. Ernest and then Dr. Sirius. So the Ernest and Sirius, again, a play on the names. But the Dr. Sirius, and we won't give anything away here, he becomes much more significant, much more of a player in the very end of this book. And it's the end of the book, and again, we're not giving anything away, that really has me scratching my head. And I don't say this as a criticism. This book ends in a rather ambiguous manner, and I like that. I usually prefer my narratives to have that kind of equivocal ending. But this is definitely equivocal, because Dr. Sirius does something, and we don't know exactly what he's done, or more significantly, why he's done it. We assume that it has something to do with this interdimensional wormhole. We haven't mentioned this yet, but at one point in this story, and it's maybe a little more than halfway through, there is kind of a big ceremony where they open this wormhole, and when they open the gateway, some being, some creature, we don't even know what kind of creature this is, it just looks freaky, comes through, and there's like some kind of interdimensional leakage going on, and starts to attack some of the people on the Integrity. I think it kills a couple of people, but also this creature ends up wrapping around one of Melody's legs. And so from that point on, she's in, it looks like a leg brace while her leg is repairing, because it did some kind of skin damage when it was a hold of her. And of course it was Christian Savvy that ended up saving her. So Dr. Savvy was rather savvy in in the way that he went about getting her attention, because it was after that she became involved, a bit enamored, while she was, let's say, intoxicated on painkillers.
You're right.
So, yeah, there's a lot that's going on here. So you have the internet reference, and their internet is, I think, an obvious moral reference to our internet and the potential uses and abuses of that. Then there's also the interdimensional wormhole and how that links up with the internet story. Again, there are just a lot of moving parts in Nottoway. I'm not exactly sure how all of them fit together, but if you metaphorically pull back from the narrative and just see it as a larger picture, so to speak, and not necessarily worry about how things fit really neatly one into the other, or maybe how they don't fit neatly one part into the other, then I think you can appreciate this book much more.
I think this is one of those books, and we talk about it all the time, that doesn't really demand multiple readings, but I think you would want to go through and read it again. The first time I read it through, I was just enjoying the story because, like you said, there's so many things going on, and there's so much to appreciate. There's the humor, there's the mystery, there's the scientific element, there's the social commentary. One of my favorite parts is pretty close to the opening, where there's a talk show going on, and the talk show host, and again, there's more name play here. The talk show host is named Summer Sumner. And on her show, she has Dr. Ernest. And this is weird the way that Cotter does this. Sometimes he will make parts of a word bold so that apparently we're supposed to put some stress on it. But anyway, when Dr. Ernest is on the show, she introduces him as Dr. Bertrand Ernest. But the way it's spelled is Dr. Bertrand Ernest. And you look Bert Ern, and I was thinking Bert and Ernie.
Bert and Ernie, yeah.
Yeah, and I don't know if that was intentional. But that is such a telling part, because there's this woman that has him on the talk show, and there's so many people there, and of course we see this all the time in talk shows if you watch them. And the host, Summer, and her audience can only understand Dr. Ernest on a very fundamental level. And when they don't understand, or when she doesn't understand what he's talking about, which is quite often, it's just turned into a joke. And that is so telling of, what we deal with here. I mean, you talk to somebody, or the rare times that you see somebody that's, that is maybe a scientist or something on a talk show, how often does the guy get to talk about deep science? It's usually turned into a joke, because, that's what people want. If you can't understand it, let's make a joke about it.
Right, exactly. Yeah, that talk show reference, and in fact, that's one of the examples that I was alluding to earlier in terms of the way that Cotter presents the exposition. One of the functions of this talk show segment is in giving us this background information that we'll need to understand much, not all, of what we're about to read in Nottoway. We're introduced to Dr. Ernest, and we get a little context about the internet and all of that. So I think that's handled very effectively. But that's a funny part of the book. You mentioned the talk show host, Summer Sumner, who I believe she's also Texan, and the way that he uses the bold wording is to bring to the fore, I guess, her kind of cadence, the way that she speaks. Mm-hmm. So not only does it function in a way that adds to the humor, as you mentioned, the Bert and Ernie, but also it gives us as readers a sense of how she talks. And he does this with other characters too, but I think especially.
Right. It's not just her.
Right. Now, something that we haven't mentioned yet, and this is something that is more in the background of this story than anything, and that is quality time with Franklin Fox.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up.
And what this is, I guess it's a kid's show, although adults seem to love it as well, especially Christian Savvy. Melody's not that big of a fan of it, although at times she does end up watching it, especially when she's high. But this is a cartoon, an animated show with a character called Franklin Fox, who gets into all of these adventures, weird predicaments. And it just struck me as a typical kind of lowbrow, easy to laugh at or laugh with, animation. Again, kind of playing to the lowest common denominator in many ways. Something like, let's say, an animated Married with Children. From years back. Not sophisticated at all. And maybe The Simpsons, I guess, would be another comparison, although The Simpsons can get quite sophisticated, and I don't think that Quality Time with Franklin Fox is that sophisticated at all.
I don't think it is. But it's interesting that in the midst of all this technology that's going on in the story and about the wormhole and the internet and all of that stuff. Here's a show, Franklin Fox, that we are told has been on the air for 40 years. And it's just like you said, Derek, it's just kind of a lowest common denominator, but it has survived.
Yeah. And you mentioned a show that has been on for 40 years, and the weird the weird juxtaposition between this older kind of technology, television, and the newer technology, the wormhole, the internet. This book, one of the ways that it opens is with a series of televisions. We see different television sets from, it looks like, different periods of history, and this sets up our first introduction, or our introduction to Quality Time with Franklin Fox. And I wanted to mention this not only within the context of the way Cotter introduces us to the role of television in our lives, just as he did with, the internet in our lives, but also to get to one of the stylistic curiosities of Cotter, and that is the way that his images are evanescent. They seem to almost kind of fade in and fade out at times. And he does this quite effectively in certain segments that link one scene to another. Earlier I mentioned that one way that I found to read Nottoway is to not really look at the sharp detail of the story and how things do or don't work together, but to kind of pull back and look at the larger picture. In other words, look at the forests, not so much the trees. Right. And I think that if we use that same kind of analogy to the way that he presents some of his art, that makes sense, because there are times where we're given very sharply defined images, and then they seem to, so to speak, blur. They get less clear, and that's usually a key that there's a transition from one scene to another, or someone is going to sleep, or someone is thinking about something else. In other words, he uses the visuals, the kind of blurring effect, if we want to call it that, to go from one scene or one event or one state of mind to another. And then at other times, you will find a blurred, or let's say an ill-defined image that comes into sharper focus and gives us, whatever the next part of the story is. And I really do appreciate that stylistic touch of Cotter's.
Yeah, he does a lot of, like you said, he does a lot of really interesting things with his transitions. And, they're actually a lot more consistent going back over it a second time than I originally thought. Mm-hmm. He does have a lot of consistency in those and what he's doing with these transitions. And they're really, like we said, there's a lot of different things going on here. There's the scraggly guy, which is not the bulk of the story, but he appears quite a bit. And then there's the rest of the story with Melody and all the other people on the space station. So and you're right, I like the way how you mentioned it, that he's got a lot of balls in the air. He's juggling a lot of different things. Somehow it all works. I'm not quite sure how. But I think maybe those transitions, maybe that's an important part of it.
Yeah. Yeah. And you mentioned toward the beginning of our conversation that this book begins with letters that then form words, and we see those words in bubbles, and then they kind of mix together into a more solid image. This is very similar to what we were just discussing in terms of the clearly defined images that become blurry, or the blurry images that become more clearly defined. Again, there's kind of a pulling into the detail at times, or a pulling back to a larger picture that, I do love the way that Cotter transitions the visuals in this way, and what that does with the narrative that he's telling.
Yeah, this is a very engaging book. If if what we have told you makes you pick it up, which we hope that you will, and Derek, I think we both agree there's a lot of depth in this book, and there's so much variety in the book. This is definitely a book to pick up and think about, but you're going to be entertained while you're thinking about it as well.
Exactly. So, Andy, you want to move on to the next title that we're going to be discussing for this week?
Yeah, let's do that.
And this is Gulag Casual. It's a collection of 5 stories from Austin English, and this is published just recently from 2D Cloud. And before we get into a discussion of Gulag Casual, I want to point out, Andy, that this is part of a Kickstarter campaign going on right now. And in fact, the Kickstarter ends later in the day that this episode goes up, which will be March 9th. So if you're listening to this episode of the Comics Alternative on March 9th, and you like what you hear in our discussion of Gulag Casual, then definitely head over to Kickstarter, and you could be a part of 2D Cloud's winter collection. The URL is www.kickstarter.com/projects/2dcloud/winter-collection. But if you just put in 2D Cloud, that's the number 2, the letter D, Cloud. It's one word, 2D Cloud. And do a search, you'll easily find it. And one of the things you'll find, or the text that you'll find that are a part of this winter collection, includes not only English's Gulag Casual, but also these books: ITDN by Andrew Burkholder, an anthology, Mirror Mirror #1 from a variety of different creators from 2D Cloud, the magazine SEC, SEC by Sarah Farrick, and another magazine, Alt Comics Magazine #2, again with various creators in it. So you can get those 5 titles as a part of the winter collection from 2D Cloud on Kickstarter. So you only have, depending on when you're listening to this, a few hours left.
Right, so hurry.
Yeah. But let's get to a discussion of Gulag Casual. Now, I was not familiar with the work of Austin English before this book. Were you?
No, I was not.
Yeah. Now, you and I said that we knew of Joshua Cotter before we read Nottoway, even though we didn't read Skyscrapers of the Midwest. But with Austin English, I had not heard of him before I saw reference to Gulag Casual.
No, I had not either, but I see that he is an artist that I think he's in the New York area, and has done lots of different things, lots of different art, done a lot of art in a lot of different venues, and it seems that from the there's a little section called a note from the author at the back of the book, that comics is something that he's been really, really passionate about during or maybe during his whole life, but he's really focused on it during the past 5 years. And he says actually in here that this work in this book is the beginning of my first real stab at making art in comics.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. And I'm glad that you mentioned the note from the author in the very back, because I think that despite the fact that it's the very back, it's a good place to start, because not only does English introduce us to who he is and his history with creating comics, but he also gives us a little bit of information on each of these 5 stories. Mm-hmm. And the 5 stories are A New York Story, The Disgusting Room, My Friend Perry, Here I Am, and Freddy's Dead. And in his note in the very back, he devotes several sentences to each of these. Now, when I first saw the note from the author, and I did read the note from the author after I read the book proper, I thought, okay, in these notes, I'll be able to understand a little more clearly what exactly is going on in all 5 of these stories. Not so. What he does is, in the notes, he gives us more of, I guess we could call it, some experiential context. In other words, if you don't know what to make of The Disgusting Room, and honestly, I'm not exactly sure what to make of The Disgusting Room. I like it. I don't know what to make of it. I was thinking, well, maybe in the note in the back, he'll give a little context of how I'm to interpret this. No such luck. But what he does give is a little background in terms of what he was doing at the time or what he was feeling, and how, in fact, I think that's one of the stories he says he had the most fun creating in this collection. So we don't get any kind of explication in the notes at the back, but that's okay. But just know that the note from the reader gives us a little context about Austen English and his experiences writing these stories, even though they won't help you to understand them any better.
Yeah, and Derek, I think the thing that I want to say about this book is I read it through twice, and I'm very much looking forward to reading through it a third time. I find the 5 stories in this collection fascinating, but the art is depicted in a visual language that's difficult for me to understand. And I don't know if other readers of this will find it difficult to understand as well. It's fascinating, but, in a way, this really expands what comics can do. I was really challenged by this book. I think there's a lot in it, and I think there's a lot that I probably, as a visual reader or looker or whatever you call it, am not quite equipped to understand yet. But the challenge of this book, I think, is really, really exciting.
Exactly. And the way you just described it, I think, is spot on, and something that will help our listeners get maybe a better grasp of English's style is the fact that one of the endorsements on the back of the book is from Gary Panter, which I think is appropriate enough. And in fact, I want to read what Panter says. And if you guys, our listeners, know who Gary Panter is and the kind of work that he does, then apply it to what we're trying to describe in terms of Austen English's style in Gulag Casual, and I think that'll really help. So anyway, Panter writes, Austen English's drawing is gelatinous, daubed, stroked, smeared, erased, redrawn, sculpted, twists, cringes, flattens out as it squashes inward, maybe reminds me one of a landscape and populace for Stravinsky folk songs or a dream program for tragic Polish puppet plays, crowded, self-replicating, and worth checking out. Okay, so, as I said earlier, if you think that the author note in the back is going to help explain things, you're going to be mistaken. If you think that Gary Panter's endorsement is going to help with understanding what was, you're going to be mistaken. I think it's a very interesting endorsement, but it does get to a bit of how at least for me, how I read Gulag Casual. In one word in Panter's endorsement really sticks out to me, and that is dream. As I was getting into, I think, the third story and not really knowing what to make of this collection of 5 stories, Gulag Casual, it occurred to me, maybe if I read this as something like a dream, then I will be able to wrap my brain around this a little more easily. And I think that what happens in these stories, as best as we can make out the plot, if we think of them as dreams where things happen, they aren't necessarily meaningful, and one event doesn't necessarily connect rationally to another, then I think it makes a little more sense. Along with that, I think the first time I read the stories in Gulag Casual, because like you mentioned, reading them more than once or twice is definitely what one should do. The first time I read them, I looked at the art, but I paid much more attention to the text. And after a while, I started just to read the text, maybe glancing at the art to get a sense of what was going on in terms of text and story. And then I would go back a second time and look at the visuals to see how the art connected to the text that I had just read. Many times, or maybe most times it didn't directly, but it tells a story from a different angle or in a different way, maybe potentially a completely different story than what the text is revealing. And if you read the text in each of these stories, what apparently goes on does seem to be somewhat like a dream, where this happened, then the next thing happened, then the third thing happened, then something else later happened that may or may not be connected to the previous things. And then it ends this way, or if we think that it ends this way because we're not really sure, because it was a dream and we woke up and we can't remember everything. I mean, that's the kind of experience I had in reading through these stories in Gulag Casual.
Derek, I think you may have hit on something that's really, really important, not just for understanding this comic, but maybe even all comics. And I think one of the questions that reading Gulag Casual demands of us is, how do we read comics? And I know that for myself, I was first drawn to comics, as probably many people were, by the visuals, and I still, in my 50s, I've been reading comics for a long time. I tend to let the visual carry me first. I will look at the visual, then I will read the text. So if you've got a panel of a guy hitting another guy, you see that, and then you expect the text to have something to do with that guy hitting the other guy, or the guy that's getting hit, his reaction to it. This is not that way. I think the key, as you mentioned to earlier, might be reading the text first and then trying to figure out, okay, how does the visual match up to what he's written in the text? I think you could probably read just the text only on these stories and have a pretty good idea of what the story is about. But when you put it together, the challenge is trying to figure out, does the text exactly match, or does the art exactly match up with the text, or is there something else that we're supposed to pull from this experience to make these things work together?
Yeah.
If that makes any sense at all.
No, it does make sense. And, I want to focus for a moment on the second story in this collection, and that is The Disgusting Room. I think this is the longest of the 5 stories, and it's probably my favorite, even though I'm not exactly sure what's going on. And I mention this because, you mentioned you can get the story from the text, not necessarily the images. Well, I think with this story, that's especially the case because the art in The Disgusting Room is a little more difficult, probably the most difficult to decipher among all 5 of these in Gulag Casual. And part of the reason is that he uses a lot of dark tones, a lot of dark colors, and also it seems to be composed of different media, because there's, I don't know if it's oil paint or watercolor, I'm not entirely sure, maybe ink as well, but also there is something almost like a collage in places where he seems to paste pieces of paper onto his illustrations or his paintings. Right. And so this visually is a dense story, if I can say that. Not just dark, but also dense. And trying to decipher what is going on from the images isn't the easiest thing. But if you read the text, then you get some very rudimentary story.
Yeah, and this is also, if I'm not mistaken, the earliest story. I think he did this one in 2010. And again, as you mentioned in the author's notes, he talks about this one being a sort of beginning or a turning point for his comics work. And he created this while he was living in Sweden. And just knowing that, and he does talk a little bit about the cultural differences between living in Sweden and living in America. Just knowing that gives you a little bit more insight into what might be going on than if you had not read that part.
Exactly. Now, I want to look in the disgusting room on page 2. And by the way, we should mention that there's no pagination in this book, although, I mean, with some of the stories you get a page number within the story, but you don't have page numbers that span the entire text, which is interesting because in the table of contents, you have certain stories appearing in, let's say, beginning on certain page numbers.
Right.
But those page numbers aren't on the pages.
Don't exist.
But anyway, this is the second page of The Disgusting Room, and it's before the story proper starts. You have the cast, and we have 4 characters that English illustrates. There's Theo, there's Margaret, Bobby, and Nikki. And then at the bottom it says, note hairstyles to keep track of who's who. Now the thing is, there's really no distinguishing hairstyle that sets one character apart. So I think that's part of the humor that's going on here is he gives us the cast in order to tell one player from the other, but we can't tell one player from the other. We can't even really tell what's going on much in this story.
Yeah.
Again, you have to rely on the text for any semblance of a narrative that's going on. But this is an interesting story, I guess, in that I guess the couple is Margaret and Bobby. They live together. The landlord or the super, the super, not the landlord, is Theo.
Right.
Theo comes to Margaret and Bobby's apartment because Margaret is helping to, tutor him in terms of language?
Right. She's actually, I think, teaching Theo how to read.
How to read. Okay, that's it. And then later on, they take in, almost like adopting, a boy by the name of Nicky. And she also helps to teach Nicky as well. And that sounds like a pretty stable premise, but from there things get a little weird. Bobby leaves, he goes someplace. I think at one point he goes walking with Nikki. Theo is there with Margaret. Margaret at one point leaves the house. I mean, things go on. Again, it's kind of dreamlike in its reasoning in that things really don't make sense, and one scene or event in the story doesn't necessarily connect rationally with another. But just go with it, okay? I mean, that's the best way of appreciating these stories is as you read through them, both the text and the images, just go with it.
And this story, The Disgusting Room, like really all of these stories are, they all have something to do with either broken relationships or family issues or, bordering maybe even on abuse. But, the one of the aspects of all of these stories, and this one in particular, that speaks to me, and I don't even know if this is what English was going for, is claustrophobia. There's so many.
That's a good point.
Yeah, there's so many of these characters that are physically pretty much wrapped around each other. And to me, it just, I don't know how much of that is just claustrophobia or like a violation of personal space, but there are all of these people in a lot of these stories that are in very close proximity to one another, whether they want to be or not. And that creates a lot of tension.
Right. And along with that, and this goes to the claustrophobia, there are a lot of rooms. People meet in one another's rooms, or people visit other people's rooms. I know in another story that I particularly liked, and that's the one that follows The Disgusting Room, My Friend Perry. This is a story where I guess the narrator, we can call him that, has a friend named Perry, and he goes over to Perry's apartment and talks with him, and he likes to go over and hang out with Perry. And then Perry has, I guess it's a significant other of some sort, and I can't remember what her name is.
Is that Moki?
Yeah, okay, yeah, Moki. And then the narrator has a sister that he lives with, or at least I think it's a sister. And then at one point, the sister goes over to Perry's apartment and notices that Perry has his hands on Moki. It's almost like he's massaging her, but he's being a little rough. And then the narrator's sister doesn't like that. And then other things go on as well. But all of this stuff takes place primarily in rooms. And then the story that follows that, Here I Am, you have what appears to be a family who is in their space doing whatever families do. And then a guy comes by and comes in, and later on leaves, but then comes back. Thus the title, Here I Am. And so he intrudes upon their space, but in a way that the family doesn't necessarily dislike it. I mean, they seem to almost welcome him in a way, if I read it correctly.
Yeah, I think you are.
Yeah, and then the stories that open and then close this collection, A New York Story, the first one, and then Freddy's Dead, they also take place in enclosed areas at times. Although, A New York Story, much of it takes place out in the street, or at least it seems to from the visuals.
Mm-hmm. I think that all of these stories do have that room element involved, and maybe even, the concept of home. I mean, home is a place where you're supposed to be safe and protected, but all of that is really turned on its head here. There are elements of intrusion, there are elements of violation, confinement, tight spaces, physical claustrophobia, and maybe even emotional claustrophobia.
If maybe a theme for this week's episode is intrusions, because we were talking about this with the interdimensional being in Nottoway, and also the internet, people's thoughts intruding one into the other. And then we have spaces and intrusions in Gulag Casual, and we even have some intrusions that we're going to get to in this third title that we're discussing for this week. Mm-hmm. So that's it. Speaking of that third title, anything else you want to mention about Gulag Casual before we move on?
No, I would just say that this is a challenging book.
Yes.
But, if you are pretty open-minded, and I would think most of the listeners to this podcast are probably pretty open-minded, I would say take the challenge. The first time I looked through it, I thought, wow, this is different. And it is different from the type of typical comics narrative that we typically read, especially a mainstream comic. But, this show is all about alternative comics. It's a challenging read, but I think it's an extremely rewarding read, too. I would say, take the challenge and dive in.
Yeah, exactly. And we should mention, again, the publisher is 2D Cloud. We do have plans to do a publisher spotlight on 2D Cloud later this year. 2D Cloud is one of those very small indie presses that I would guess the vast majority of our listeners had not yet heard of before this episode. I know I didn't hear of 2D Cloud before Small Press Expo last year. In fact, when you and I were there back in September, I met those guys by visiting their table. Mm-hmm. And then talked with them, and this is how I came to know some of these titles like Gulag Casual and others that we're going to be discussing later this year when we do a publisher spotlight on 2D Cloud. So this is one of those very small indie presses that when we say indie and alternative, we're not talking about Image, we're not talking about Dark Horse, we're talking indie and small. And these are the kind of presses over the past couple of years we've been doing more work on and doing more coverage. I like that. And so I look forward to talking about more 2D Cloud comics in the months to come.
Yeah, definitely.
Well, Andy, before getting to the last title for this week, we should remind our listeners that one of our sponsors for this episode is Just Coffee Co-op. If you're listening to this and need a little jolt of caffeine, then you would do well to visit their website. That's justcoffee.coop. They have a lot of great coffees, teas, and chocolates. And upon checkout, if you enter the coupon code COMICS, COMICS, you get 10% off of your coffee order. Plus, you help out us, the Comics Alternative. So that's justcoffee.coop, a great place to get caffeinated.
And don't forget, free shipping.
That's right, free shipping. But with this next title that we're going to discuss, I don't know if we need caffeine for this because what goes on, it's definitely going to wake you up.
That's for sure.
Yeah. Now, this is Haunted Love #1. This is part of Yo Books, and this is a brand new title just out from IDW and Yo Books. And I think one way of describing Haunted Love, and this is number 1 of 3, although there could be more issues of Haunted Love. Last time we had Craig on the show back in January, in fact the first one of 2016, he mentioned that if the sales for Haunted Love are good, we just may get more than 3 issues of it.
Well, let's hope that we do get more than 3 issues of it, because this was a really fun issue.
Yeah, and this is, I think, a good way of describing this is a mix between haunted horror and weird love. Mm-hmm. And if you listen to the podcast, you know what those titles are. Because what Craig does with both haunted horror and weird love is he takes, well, especially with haunted horror, maybe not so much with weird love, pre-code horror comics or pre-code comics and collects them almost like, in anthology form. And they have something weird and offbeat about them. Now, with haunted horror, they're all pre-code, and so it's a kind of horror comic that you won't find after the mid to late 1950s. And then with Weird Love, some of that stuff is pre-code, but much of it isn't, like maybe even the 1960s and 1970s. But it's weird, okay? So you have the horror stuff in haunted horror. You have the love romance comics in Weird Love. Now, what would happen if you combine those 2 projects of Craig's? Haunted Love.
Yes, the unholy spawn of haunted horror and weird love. And in case you missed it, it tells you on the cover that this is a Yomance publication.
Yeah. That. Yeah. Now, we have in this first issue, and as you usually get with Yo books, you get a lot for your buck. And in this number 1 issue, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 haunted romance stories or horror romance stories that, well, all of them are strange and whacked out. I was trying to think before we recorded which one is the craziest. Which one do you think is the most whacked out of the 7? Man.
You know, Derek, I had a really weird moment with the very first story, Crawling Evil. I may be wrong, because I've got a brother that's 12 years older than I am, and he had a lot of comics lying around the house when I was a little kid. I think I read Crawling Evil when it first came out, or when he kept it, because he would have bought it probably, when he was 10 years old or so.
Yeah. Now
this I'm pretty sure I read this.
Yeah.
Early.
Now this originally appeared in 1952 in the comic book Journey into Fear.
Yeah, he could have had it.
Yeah. And, one of the great things that Craig does in all of his comics like this, whether in comic book form or collected in nice hardbound editions, is he gives as much context as possible. So we know that this appeared in issue number 10 of Journey into Fear, which had a date of November 1952, and then the art is by the Iger Shop. With the writer of these, and Craig has said this on the show a few times, sometimes it's difficult to find out all the details of the creators, but he'll give as much information as possible. So some of the artists and colorists for some of the stories in Haunted Love number 1 are names that you may recognize. For instance, Nick Cardy did the art of the story Nothing Can Save Her, which appeared in Adventure into Darkness in 1953. And then others, like, for instance, Crawling Evil, we don't know exactly who did it, but it's an Iger Shop project. So who knows could have done this. And then with some of the other creators, their names aren't as well known, like Leonard Frank or Ed Goldfarb. But, Craig does give as much information as he can. Now, when I asked you the weirdest story, you said Crawling Evil is one that you remembered. That has to be probably my choice for the weirdest story in this first issue.
Yeah, it is totally twisted.
Yeah.
Totally.
Yeah, and basically what it is a story of this young woman who, when she was growing up with her grandmother, it begins with the little girl and her grandmother, walking down this path, and they come across some men, and the grandmother spits on the men, and then the men call her an old witch. And then when they get back to the house, the young girl says, Grandma, why don't you like those men? And then her grandmother says, all men are evil, and you have to watch out for them because they'll do you wrong. There's a little backstory here that we, learn why the grandmother doesn't like men. And so then this young girl grows up to be a young woman who hates men. And in fact, she finds out after her grandmother passes that she's a witch, and her witch grandmother bequeathed some spell books to her. And so this young girl learns to cast a spell that turns men, when she kisses them, into worms.
Yeah. And
literal worms.
Yeah, and it's some really bad things happen to these worms. And it's weird because the worms have like a man's head. It's all worm except for the head looks exactly like a man.
Yeah, so this is like Charles Burns before Charles Burns.
Yeah, exactly.
Exactly. The men-headed worms. And the way that this ends, and I don't think that this would be considered spoiler because these are very short stories and they have some very whacked out, twisted endings. It's almost like an O. Henry ending that this woman makes it a point to see men, to lure them, to kiss them, turn them into worms, and then literally step on them, right? Well, the last man she meets, she ends up, as you might expect, falling in love with him. Mm-hmm. And so he wants to kiss her. She doesn't want to because she doesn't want to kill him or turn him into a worm. But then through various means, she does end up kissing him and turns him into a worm. And when the story ends, and it's the ending, the last panel that is the weirdest, we see her on the floor and she's attempting to kill herself, and then she's covered with worms. Now, we don't know where all of these worms are coming from. Is this like when she's taking the poison, is she hallucinating, or are these really literal worms crawling on her past men that she's turned into? I mean, don't try to figure it out.
Yeah. Just enjoy it.
Just enjoy it or be disturbed by it. Either one. Maybe both.
Maybe both. Especially the worm that's coming out of her mouth in the last panel.
Oh, I forgot about the worm coming out of her mouth. I see what you're saying. Oh, God, yeah.
Sorry about the spoiler.
No. But again, I mean, that these stories are going to end really weird. I think, speaking of weird endings, the one story of these 7 that seemed to have the most conventional ending, if I can call it conventional, is The Iceman Cometh. And I'm not talking about Eugene O'Neill, by the way. This is a different Iceman that cometh in a different way, yeah.
If you're expecting Mr. O'Neill, you may be disappointed, or you may be delighted.
Yeah, depending on your thoughts of his drama. But this does deal with an Iceman. And, of course, it has to do with romance, because this is called Haunted Love, after all. And the way that this ends, and I don't want to give away this ending, do you think it's more conventional horror story? The way that
it is. It seems like
pre-code conventional.
Yeah, it seems like it would be more in line with some of those, some of the EC, like Tales from the Crypt and those types of endings that readers might be a little bit more familiar with. But yeah, it's got a really, really cool ending, and I like how in all of these stories, there's little elements of humor. One of the things about this is about this woman whose husband is the last ice manufacturer in town. Everybody else is buying electric refrigerators, and this guy still has an ice delivery service. He's way out of line, even though this takes place in 1926. And anyway, the husband hires a new Iceman because his wife's always complaining about the old guys dripping ice all over the place, and the place gets nasty. And the new guy is really, hot and good looking. And I love when the husband comes home and he says, "How's the new Iceman, Lillian? Satisfied with his work?" And she says, "Yes, Henry, completely satisfied." I mean, it's just little touches like that just really, really elevate it up,
Yeah, exactly. the one that comes after that, Lady or the Tigress, is another one that is completely whacked out. And that's a contender for one of the strangest. I still think that Crawling Evil is the weirdest of this collection. But Lady or Tigress, and this is someone who oversees a zoo. They get a new tiger, and we learn that the tiger is also this woman who morphs from woman to tiger, from tiger to woman. And that's basically the story.
Yeah.
And the title,
that's it.
Lady or the Tigress.
And that's fine. But it's well done. It's captivating. It's well done. It's well written. The art is very convincing. It's just fun.
Yeah, it is. And the woman, the way that the artist on this is Leonard Frank, and it appeared in This Magazine is Haunted from 1953. The way he draws the woman, I mean, she does look tigress, I guess. So that was an interesting one. Another one of my favorites in this collection, though, is The Dead Are Never Lonely. And this is another one that reminds me of the kind of horror that we got from, let's say, classic EC.
Right.
Yeah. This is illustrated by Jim McLaughlin, and it appeared in 1953 in an issue of Baffling Mysteries. And this is about a woman who, okay, how do I explain this?
She's a glamorous Hollywood star,
right?
Young Hollywood star, and she marries this English nobleman for basically just for the publicity and the title that goes along, what goes along with being his wife. And I guess it's not really much of a spoiler to say that he kills her. Or
she kills him.
Or she... that's right, she kills him, and then the death comes as an actual character. Death comes. And maybe this isn't quite the end for her. And I won't tell you what happens to her, but she undergoes a really interesting change, and it's really disturbing. And actually, this is one of those stories that's kind of sad, but it's also a great horror story too. Again, it doesn't go exactly where you think it's going to go.
Yeah,
which is cool.
Now, you mentioned something about a spoiler with this story. I don't think it'd be a spoiler to say that what happens to her is not entirely clear. I mean, is she or isn't she dead? I mean, I think she is.
That's the thing.
Yeah, but I think that the way that this story is told, and again, these are very short stories that only take place over a few pages, and so it's not exactly clear how she is in the situation that she's in. How did she die, and how is this linked to her killing her husband? Well, again, don't worry about it. Don't try to figure things out. Just go with the flow, and enjoy the story here. But this story also reminds me of the very last one of this first issue of Haunted Love, and that is, again, another one of my favorites here, and that's Marriage of Death.
Yeah.
And this originally, I think this is the earliest in this first issue. This came out in 1950 in Adventures into the Unknown. And this is actually probably the most sophisticated of the 7 stories in this first issue, because here we have a series of nestled narratives. In other words, we have one person telling a story to someone else, and that this story includes a story where someone tells someone else something. So it's a story within a story within a story. Now, this is not metafictional to the point that it's not a story about telling stories, but it uses the convention of the nestled narrative, a story within a story, in order to tell what goes on in Marriage of Death. And basically what you have here is someone ends up falling in love with death, and because death loves her, she can never age until he doesn't love her, until he finds another woman.
Right.
You don't think of death, finding another woman.
Right.
But he does, and of course, when he moves on, he drops the other woman, and then then she becomes I won't say becomes really old, because that's an understatement. She becomes something else entirely.
Mm-hmm. And the thing I like about all of these stories, Derek, except for maybe the let's see, which one was it? Nothing Can Save Her. That one was pretty predictable as far as how it was going to end, but for the most part, and when you read something like the old EC comics, I mean, those are a lot of fun, but a lot of times you can tell how it's going to end. You can see it coming. But with most of these, you don't really know exactly what's going to happen, or it's tweaked up a little bit and it takes you in a direction that you weren't quite ready for. So these are a lot of fun, and you got to credit Craig Yo for finding these stories that are just as good now as they were back in the 50s. I mean, these are some really good stories.
Yeah, and then they're fun. Now, you mentioned the predictability of Nothing Can Save Her. The one that comes after that, The Weirdest Suicide Pack of All Times, that's another one that's a little predictable.
Yeah, and it's a really, really short story. I mean, it's like 3 pages long, I think, or something like that, 3 or 4 pages.
Yeah, that's almost like a palate cleanser, if you want to look at it that way, before you get to the final story, Marriage of Death. But yeah, all 7 of the stories in this first issue of Haunted Love are just a lot of fun. Mm-hmm. And, Craig Yo, once again, hits it out of the ballpark.
Well, Craig's got a love for the stuff, and that's obvious from, if you've ever read any of his titles, he really loves this stuff and cares about it and is knowledgeable about it too. And he goes to a lot of, trouble to give us those details that we talked about, digging up who drew these, who was the inker, what issue of what publication it came out with. So, I mean, not only are these a lot of fun, but it's good comics history as well.
Well, Andy, boy, we had a lot on our plate for this week. We started off with Joshua W. Cotter's Not Away. After that, we looked at Gulag Casual from Austin English. And then we wrapped up with Haunted Love #1 from Craig Yo. So a lot of different kind of comics, one radically different from the other.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we definitely recommend that you check out all 3 of these titles. And another thing that we recommend is that you go to take our survey. Again, this is a call to action. We want you guys to take our survey. Go to survey.libsyn.com/comicsalternative. That's survey.libsyn.com/comicsalternative, one word. And just answer 6 very quick questions. And if you put in your email address, you'll be entered in a future drawing to win a Comics Alternative t-shirt. And by the way, let me mention that when it comes to your email address, neither we nor Libsyn uses that email address for anything, really, other than us using your email in the drawing. So definitely do go to survey.libsyn.com/comicsalternative and take the quick survey. Also, make sure you check out one of our sponsors for this episode, Discount Comic Book Service. And in fact, if you go to dcbservice.com right now and do a search for Not Away, you'll find that you can get it at 35% off of the cover price. So it's a great deal. That's dcbservice.com. And after you do get your comics there, be sure to let us know what you think of this episode. If you go to the website, comicsalternative.com, you'll see that you can leave us a voice message through SpeakPipe. It's very simple and easy to use. Or you can call us the old-fashioned way if you want to be difficult about things. Pick up the phone and call 415-3-COMICS. That's 415-326-6427.
And it's a great idea to follow us on Twitter, and that's where you can find all the updates to the blog and any kind of news-related items that we have. You can follow us there at the number 2 guys with PhDs, and we certainly appreciate everybody that retweets our tweets.
That's right. You can also email us, as many of you do. We're 2guys@comicsalternative.com. You can contact me directly at Derek@comicsalternative.com. And Andy, how can they get in touch with you?
You can reach me at Wolverton@comicsalternative.com.
You can also find us on other places in the social media sphere, such as Facebook, Tumblr, Instagram, Google+, Goodreads, Pinterest, and YouTube. You can subscribe to the podcast through iTunes. You can stream us on Stitcher. You can also find us on TuneIn. And, as always, you can find every single one of our podcast episodes, as well as the reviews and the comics-related commentary that we post on our blog at our website, which is comicsalternative.com.
Lots of ways to bump into us. Let us know how we're doing.
Yeah, and we do like to hear from you guys.
Yeah.
Yeah. Until next week, I'm Derek.
And I'm Andy.
We'll see you later.